October 13th, 1942, 6:40 a.m., Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A battered Wildcat limped out of the smoke, engine sputtering, propeller barely spinning. Ground crews just stopped dead. The plane slammed down, bounced and skidded. Then it stopped. The damage was obvious once the dust cleared. Over 250 bullet holes, shredded wings, torn panels, fuel lines ripped. But then the canopy lifted. Joe Foss climbed out, steady, calm, and completely unhurt. He stepped off the wing while men stared at the wreck, trying to figure out how the plane was destroyed, but the pilot wasn't. How could the plane be destroyed, but the pilot be fine? Joe Foss came from a place where dreams usually died young. A small farm in South Dakota, flat land, harsh winters, long days. His family wasn't rich. When his father died suddenly in 1933, 18-year-old Joe had no time to grieve. He took over the farm, carrying the weight of a man twice his age. He learned quickly that no one was coming to save them. But even with all that work, he held on to one obsession: flying. He watched planes over the cornfields, memorizing engine sounds. Every spare dollar he earned, money others used for clothes or roofs, went straight to flying lessons. At a tiny airfield outside town, ground instructors knew him as the dirt-covered farm kid. But he flew like his life depended on staying in the air. As war spread in Europe, he knew America would join. He wanted that cockpit. So he hitchhiked hundreds of miles, sleeping in barns, riding in truck beds, to reach a naval recruiter. He expected a warm welcome. Instead, they looked at his age and shrugged. "Too old for fighters, we'll make you an instructor. Teaching rookies while others fought? No way." Joe pushed back harder than they expected, getting into advanced training through sheer stubbornness. At Pensacola, he wasn't the best student, not the clean-cut officer type. He was rough around the edges, older, carrying himself like someone who'd seen real hardship. But instructors saw what mattered. He stayed calm when others panicked, never choked under pressure. He even broke a record on a gunnery test, scoring only beat by top Navy marksmen. Still, the Navy didn't rush him. They parked him as a flight instructor. Weeks turned into months. He was itching for combat while younger pilots shipped out. He refused to stay grounded. He volunteered for every assignment involving combat aircraft, trained until he knew the Wildcat by heart. He requested transfers so often, officers joked he was trying to break the system with persistence. Eventually, the system gave way. Joe Foss got orders for a combat unit heading to the Pacific. He packed one duffel bag. Before leaving, his mother hugged him and said the last words he'd hear from home for a long time. "If you get the chance to fly, don't waste it." He'd say he didn't. The transport ship moved toward the shore under a dim Pacific dawn. Joe Foss stood on deck, watching Guadalcanal rise from the mist. It didn't look like the center of a desperate campaign, just jungle, mountain, swamp. But everyone on that ship knew the truth. Whoever held this place held the doorway to Australia. As they got closer, the sounds grew clearer. Distant artillery, anti-aircraft guns, a low rolling echo. Marines called it the daily drumbeat. Newcomers heard the sound of a battle already tipping toward collapse. Joe stepped onto the beach with his duffel bag, flight gear, and a sense he was walking into something bigger than he'd trained for. A jeep took him along a narrow jungle road to Henderson Field. He saw wrecked trucks, burned positions, Marines with faces carved by sleepless nights. They weren't impressed by rank, only by who survived. When the jeep crested a rise, Joe finally saw the airfield. Henderson wasn't a base, it was a scar in the jungle. The runway was pitted with shell holes. Craters overlapped. Fuel drums were stacked behind sandbags. Aircraft wrecks lined the trees. Some burned to their frames, others half buried where they'd crashed. It looked worse up close. Dust hung over the strip like fog. Ground crews moved slowly, exhausted from fixing planes that never stayed whole for more than a day. Wildcat fighters sat in a crooked line patched with scrap metal. Aircraft held together by welding, wire, and luck. Joe met the pilots he'd be flying with. 17, 18, 19 years old. Too young to vote, but already seasoned by brutal combat. Their uniforms were sun-bleached, hands blistered, eyes carrying the hollow look of men who'd watched friends die. One pilot shook Joe's hand and said, "If you hear the alarms before breakfast, skip the breakfast." Another added, "If you hear them at night, stay away from the fuel dump unless you want to glow." There was no bravado, only survival. The briefing officer gave Joe his first real sense of the situation. Japanese bombers attacked daily. Zeros swept in ahead of them. Artillery from ships hit the field at night. Every sunrise meant trying to keep the runway intact long enough to get fighters airborne. Then came the line that stuck. "We lose planes faster than we can count them. We lose pilots even faster." Joe walked to the revetments where his Wildcat waited. Mechanics were replacing a shredded control cable. Tools lay scattered in the dirt. Every part hand-fitted by men who'd slept 3 hours in the last 20. The chief mechanic looked at him and said, "Lieutenant, this plane isn't pretty, but if you treat her right, she'll get you home once or twice." Joe didn't smile. He knew why the man said, "once or twice." That afternoon, the air raid siren wailed. Long, rising, unmistakable. Pilots sprinted for their fighters. Ground crews dived into trenches. Black dots appeared on the northern horizon. It was Foss's first launch from Henderson Field. The moment his wheels left the ground, Joe understood what kind of place he'd come to. Guadalcanal wasn't a battlefield. It was a meat grinder over the ocean, and he had just stepped into it at full speed. Joe reached altitude, just as the Japanese formation broke through the clouds. The first thing he noticed wasn't their numbers, but how clean and coordinated the Zeros looked. They moved like a single organism, banking and climbing with precision he'd never seen in training. There was no easing into combat on Guadalcanal. No warm-up fights. Foss rolled into the attack the moment a Zero drifted into his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger, felt the Wildcat's guns shake the cockpit, and watched flashes walk across the enemy's fuselage. The Zero burst into flame and spiraled down, his first kill. He didn't have time to celebrate. 3 more Zeros dropped on him at once. Their tracers stitched across his right wing, ripping cloth and metal in long, precise lines. Joe kicked the rudder, rolled hard, and dove straight through their formation, trying to force a merge that would break their angles. The Wildcat shook violently. More hits. More metal tearing away. A burst of fire struck so close it rattled the instrument panel. Joe kept fighting, jinking left, diving, climbing, pushing the aircraft harder than it wanted to go. He managed to slip behind one of the pursuers, fired a short burst, and saw it peel off trailing smoke. But the other 2 stayed glued to him, patient and disciplined. Every time he tried to extend, they closed the distance. Every time he tried to climb, they slid into firing position. His engine began to cough, oil pressure dropping, temperature spiking. The Wildcat had taken more punishment in 90 seconds than it was ever designed for. Joe squeezed everything out of the engine, skimming the treetops until the ground blurred. A Zero stayed locked to his tail, firing in controlled bursts. A round shattered his canopy rail. Another tore through the fuselage behind his seat. Joe pushed the engine to its limit, flying so low the trees blurred by. A MiG stayed glued to his tail, firing short, controlled bursts. One bullet hit his canopy rail. Another ripped through the fuselage right behind him. The engine finally conked out. It sputtered, coughed, and died. Joe was already gliding. No power, no climb, no time left. He aimed for a clearing past the runway, pulled back just enough to keep the nose up, and landed with a hard thump. The Wildcat skidded through dirt and bushes, crashed through some small palm trees, and lurched into a shallow ditch. Smoke filled the cockpit. The windshield cracked. The harness dug into his shoulders as the plane came to a rough stop. For a moment he sat still, wondering if he was hurt. He wasn't. Again. He shoved the canopy open and climbed out as ground crews ran toward him through the smoke. They reached him expecting injuries. Instead, they found him brushing dust off his collar and looking back at the wreck, as if trying to figure out how many seconds he'd bought himself by stretching that glide. What shocked the men around him wasn't the crash, it was the quiet way he walked away, as if surviving the impossible was just part of the job. Later that day, during a short break, he looked across the protective barriers at the tired young pilots who had watched him go down. They weren't cheering his first kill. They were waiting to see if he would take the next mission with the same calm they needed from a leader. Joe understood what their eyes were saying. They needed someone to follow, someone steady when everything else was falling apart. The war had put him in that role faster than he thought. The next morning, Joe checked out his replacement Wildcat. Replacement was a kind word. The plane looked like it was put together from 3 different wrecks, with mismatched panels, uneven rivets, and a fresh paint job that barely hid the damage underneath. Ground crews were proud of it, though. On Guadalcanal, a plane that could fly was already a big deal. Joe ran his hand along the wing and tapped the panel near the gun ports. 6 guns? He asked. The crew chief nodded. That's what it came with. Joe shook his head. Take 2 off. Joe pointed at the ammo belts. We're short on 50 calories ammo. I'd rather have 4 guns with full belts than 6 guns that run dry in 20 seconds. It wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't even regulation. But on Guadalcanal, rules didn't matter. Results did. The crew chief gave a slow nod. The kind Marines gave to men who'd proven themselves in combat. Within an hour, Foss had a lighter Wildcat, set up to fire longer, hit harder, and dive faster. That small change, the gun setup, ended up defining the pilots who gathered around him in the next few days. They were young, eager, and untested, but they watched his every move, how he aimed for firing, how he rolled into an attack, how he used the Wildcat's weight to make a zero pilot make a mistake. They started copying him mission after mission. During briefings, they stayed close to him, not because of his rank. He wasn't formal like a senior officer, but because he spoke clearly and never wasted time on show. Every word came from experience. Close the distance, he told them. Zeros are faster when climbing. Don't fight them there. Use your dive. Hit them at 200 yards. Pilots wrote it down. Others whispered it. Soon, when Joe walked to his plane, 6 or 7 of them followed him automatically, like a small group around its leader. Someone joked that they looked like an old circus act, a ringmaster with his performers. The name stuck. Foss's Flying Circus. It wasn't an official unit, but everyone on the island knew who they were. They took on the toughest missions. They launched with little warning. They were the first in the air when bombers appeared on the horizon, and the last to land when fuel was almost gone. Marines teased them for their confidence, but it wasn't arrogance. It was the belief that came from watching Joe dive through enemy formations without hesitation, and from surviving long enough to think maybe they could do the same. Their spirit didn't come from speeches or ceremonies. It came from the rhythm of combat they found together. Take off, climb, fight, repair, sleep if possible, then start over. They learned each other's flying styles quickly. Who stayed tight in formation, who tended to drift high on right turns, who needed a quick signal before diving in, who would be there when things got bad. By the second week, something new started showing in their missions, a boldness that wasn't there before Foss arrived, a willingness to attack even when outnumbered, a belief they could win dogfights they shouldn't survive. The pace of the campaign changed the moment Foss's Flying Circus started flying regular missions. Every single day brought a new danger, a new formation on the horizon, or a new reason to scramble before breakfast. The sky over Guadalcanal was never quiet for long. Most mornings started the same way. The distant sound of ship guns, the rising wail of the air raid siren, and the quick scramble of pilots running across the strip while mechanics removed chocks from the landing gear. Sleep became optional. Rest was a luxury no one could afford. For Joe, the days blurred together, climbing into the cockpit before the engine was even warm, taking off from the runway still smoking from night bombings, and heading straight for whatever the Japanese were sending next. Some mornings it was bombers, Betty-Nels flying in tight V formations, engines shining. In the sun, Foss preferred diving through their escorts instead of flying around them. He believed the quickest way to reach the bombers was to break straight through the zero screen. The younger pilots followed him without hesitation. Other days brought only long, tough fighter sweeps, 20, 30, sometimes more zeros, trying to wear down Henderson Field with sheer persistence. Joe fought them in short, intense bursts, using the Wildcat's dive speed and protection to survive, forcing the fight into angles where the Zero's agility mattered less. He almost crashed several times. Once, when his elevator cable got stuck. Once, when his fuel tank took a hit and started leaking a shimmering trail. And once, when his canopy fogged up so badly after a climb that he had to fly mostly blind, wiping it with his sleeve until he could see again. Every landing was risky. The strip was damaged, muddy, and covered with debris from earlier fights. On bad days, Wildcats landed so low on fuel that their engines died before touching the ground. One pilot slid in with less than a quarter-gallon left. No one laughed. It could have been any of them. Fatigue hit harder than the dogfights. Pilots flew twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Nights were spent in foxholes while Japanese destroyers shelled the field. Sleep was interrupted by explosions, shaking the ground and the sound of shrapnel hitting palm trees. Yet almost every morning, Foss's small group took off again. Joe's kill count started rising almost immediately. 5 victories in less than a week. 8 by the next. By the 9th day, he was an ace, something most pilots never achieved in their entire careers. But the real change wasn't Joe's numbers. It was in how the young pilots fought. They started closing to the same close range Joe liked, 200 yards, sometimes closer. They timed their dives more closely. They protected each other more aggressively. They learned to spot danger a split second sooner, to roll out of a trap before it formed, and to keep moving even when the odds were against them. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports started mentioning a new, unusually aggressive flight group operating out of Henderson Field. They didn't know the pilots' names, but they recognized the pattern. Tight dives, sudden turns, accurate shots that broke up formations. During one afternoon attack, Foss's group tore through a bomber formation so fast that ground observers counted enemy planes falling from the sky before the bombers even reached the field's edge. Marines watched the whole battle from foxholes and trenches, cheering as Wildcats streaked overhead with the sun glinting off their wings. By the end of the first month, the flying circus had built a reputation that spread across the island. If Foss's group was flying, the field had a chance. All of this was just the beginning. The worst night and the most important morning hadn't hit yet. Just after 1 a.m., the first, Japanese flares started dropping over Henderson Field, bright white, blinding, turning the jungle into harsh daylight. A second later, naval guns opened fire. Shells from cruisers and destroyers offshore blasted the runway, tossing dirt, metal, and burning debris skyward. The ground shook like an earthquake. Tents caved in. Fuel drums burst open. Planes in the revetments caught fire, one by one, making the palm trees glow orange. Pilots and ground crews hit the ground, covering their heads as metal fragments flew overhead. Every few minutes, another flare dropped, lighting up the field so the Japanese gunners could aim better. Each explosion got closer to the Wildcats, the few still working, rare, valuable, barely held together by months of fighting and repairs. There was nowhere safe. Foxholes filled with smoke and dust, shrapnel cut through sandbags like knives. The bombing lasted over an hour, each blast rolling across the island like thunder. By the time the shelling stopped, Henderson Field looked like it had been ripped open. Craters dotted the runway. Burning planes lit the eastern edge of the strip. One of the maintenance huts was completely gone, leaving only scattered tools and bits of corrugated metal. The Marines fought the fires with anything they could find. Helmets, jackets, barely working extinguishers. Pilots stumbled out of dugouts, coughing, covered in dirt, checking if their planes were still there. The Japanese plan was simple: destroy the field at night, take it by morning. At dawn, they sent in the final blow. Lookouts spotted the incoming planes first, bombers with no escorts, flying straight for the smoking wreck of the airfield. If they reached it, nothing would be left to defend. Pilots ran for their planes. Foss reached his Wildcat and got in while mechanics pulled away. Debris still stuck under the wings. Another crewman yanked a dented fuel hose off the ground and yelled something Joe couldn't hear over the growing engine noise. 2 Wildcats failed during startup. Another blew a hydraulic line. That left 6 fighters, 6 to face an entire incoming Japanese attack. Joe didn't hesitate. He throttled up and rolled through a gap between 2 craters, taking off before the wheels had fully locked. The others followed, climbing as fast as their engines allowed. Smoke from the night, bombing still hung over the field, making the sky patchy and unclear. As they broke through the haze, the enemy formation spread out before them. Rows of bombers, flanked by fighters, descending to destroy the airfield once and for all. Joe pushed the nose down and dove straight at them. His first burst hit a Zero trying to block him. The plane exploded into pieces. He pulled up, rolled left, and slid behind a bomber, firing into its right engine until it burst into flames. The bomber fell away, trailing smoke like a burning comet. Another Zero tried to climb onto his tail. Joe snapped into a steep dive, the kind pilots avoided because it pushed the Wildcat to its structural limits. The Zero overshot. Joe turned, squeezed the trigger, and tore the fighter apart with a 2-second burst. He climbed again. Fuel was low. Ammunition was half gone. But the formation was breaking. Marines on the ground watched the whole fight happen above them, tiny specks maneuvering through the smoke, each flash of gunfire marking another moment of survival or death. In under 30 minutes, the Japanese attack lost momentum. Too many bombers were shot down. Too many fighters were disrupted. Their tight formation was now scattered, unstable, unable to coordinate the strike. Joe landed briefly to refuel and rearm, engine still running, then took off again without leaving the cockpit. On this second run, he downed 2 more Zeros, bringing his total for the morning to 5. The 6 Wildcats of Henderson Field had done the impossible. They had stopped a major Japanese attack with minimal fuel, repaired planes, and sheer determination not to give up the airfield. That morning became a legend on the island. Ground crews didn't discuss tactics or numbers. They talked about the moment they saw Foss turn his Wildcat for another pass, even when the sky was full of enemy fighters and the runway was still burning. Nothing about that day felt heroic to the pilots. It was survival, brutal, urgent, necessary. But for the men on the ground, it was something else entirely. Proof that the Japanese could be stopped in the air, even against overwhelming odds. And it set the stage for what would happen next. By late October, everyone on Guadalcanal felt the pace change. The Marines on the ridge were still fighting for every inch of jungle, but overhead, something else was happening, something the Japanese hadn't expected. Foss and his 7 pilots had found a rhythm that made their small squadron punch far above its weight. Joe wasn't the most stylish flyer, and the Wildcat wasn't the fastest plane in the sky. But together they created a deadly pattern the Japanese kept underestimating. Their encounters stopped looking like random dogfights, started looking like calculated hunts. Joe closed the distance quickly, fired only when close, enough to see the enemy cockpit, then rolled away before anyone could shoot back. His men copied every move, learning the timing, the discipline, and the nerve it took to fly like that. The Wildcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns could shred a zero in under a second. But they also used ammo incredibly fast. Foss knew it, felt it every time he pulled the trigger. That's why he removed 2 guns. Fewer barrels, longer endurance, same stopping power. Up close, it wasn't in any manual, but it gave him the advantage he needed, and his men did the same. Day after day, they took off from damaged runways and through smoke, facing Japanese formations that always seemed bigger, newer, and better equipped. But numbers stopped mattering. Foss's flight attacked from high up when possible, from the sun when lucky, and from pure instinct when neither was an option. And the score started to climb. A zero was clipped at the merge. A Betty bomber spiraled into Iron Bottom Sound. Recon planes trying to sneak past the coast never came home. 1 kill became 5, 5 became 15, and soon every pilot in the group had a record that would make a veteran proud. Maintenance crews patched bullet holes all night, salvaged parts from wrecks, siphoned fuel from damaged planes, anything to keep the Wildcats flying. By the time the fighting peaked, the numbers were incredible. In just 90 days, the 7 Marines of Foss's flying circus destroyed 72 Japanese aircraft, an impossible feat on an island that was supposed to fall weeks earlier. Foss was responsible for 26 of them. The rest came from the men who followed him into the sky. Trusting his leadership, his nerve, and his willingness to be the first Wildcat into the fight, Guadalcanal was still burning on the ground, but above the island the balance had shifted permanently. By December, the air war's intensity had changed. Japanese raids still occurred, but not with the same force, not with the same confidence. The worst of Guadalcanal's chaos had passed, leaving behind a quieter kind of exhaustion, one that seeped into every part of the airfield. It hit Joe the hardest. The fever came on suddenly. One morning he woke up, soaking wet and shaking, unable to lift his head from the cot. The medics immediately recognized malaria. Within hours, he was too weak to stand, drifting in and out of consciousness, while aircraft engines sounded somewhere outside the thin canvas walls. Ground crews fixed Wildcats without him. Pilots scrambled without him. The runway thundered as his men launched missions he should have been leading. Days later, the fever finally broke. He had lost weight, his strength gone, but as soon as he could walk unassisted, he made his way back to the flight line. No speeches, no announcements. He just showed up, strapped in, and waited for the signal. January 15th, 1943. His first flight since being sick. The Japanese arrived just as he cleared the coast. A group of Zeros dove from high up, looking for returning Marine bombers. Joe climbed toward the fight, cut across their turn, and shot down the first one cleanly. Moments later, a second fell in flames, then a third. 3 kills in a single flight, after weeks in bed. When he taxied to a stop on the runway, the cheering wasn't from adrenaline, it was relief. The squadron had its commander back, but the officers waiting by the dispersal hut brought different news. Washington had issued direct orders. Joe Foss was to return home immediately. The paperwork explained why. Over 3 months of combat, every kill had been recorded, verified, and compared against national records. His total had reached 26 confirmed victories, matching Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the First World War. Joe had spent the campaign focused on keeping his pilots safe. Only now, as he packed his gear, did he grasp the full impact of his flying months. Not just top Marine Corps scores, but the highest American tally of the war at that point. Guadalcanal still raged behind him, but his mission there was accomplished. Joe Foss returned to a nation already aware of him. Newspapers had detailed his victories for months. Radio hosts spoke of him as if he were a legend from a bygone era. None of it felt real to him, Guadalcanal had been too intense, too chaotic, too brutal for the label hero to feel right. He had no interest in parades or ceremonies. He'd seen too many vacant chairs in ready rooms to value fame built on statistics. The pilots he'd trained, flown with, and mourned, those were the faces that remained. Not the 26 victories credited to him, but the country sought his public presence, so he traveled. Bond rallies, interviews, crisp uniforms, and medals presented by people who'd never heard